Our second writer tonight is Lynne Handy, and we've heard Lynne's poetry here at Waterline several times, and I've always really admired and respected her as a poet. But I also read her novel In the Time of Peacocks, which she has over there, and I think it's a steal at $10. And after I read it, I talked to her about, I really wanted her to read some fiction at some point. What she sent me was not from In the Time of Peacocks. It was from her new novel, Where the River Runs Deep. The first chapter, she sent me the first chapter, and at first she and I didn't see quite eye to eye on the first chapter. But I have to say, like 5.5 years of doing this, I cannot believe how wonderful it's been to work with all the different writers, hundreds of different writers, and the character of all the writers that I've worked with. It's really wonderful. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing Lynne Handy read Chapter 1 from Where the River Runs Deep tonight. Lynne?
Is this right? You can hear me well? All right. Before I read chapter 1, I want to show you this wonderful cover, and I want to thank all the people who helped me get this book lined up to be published. And Bill Pack did this wonderful cover, so I want to mention that. Kevin Moriarty did the formatting for publication, and he's so wonderful to work with. John Aarons helped me find the title, and I'm grateful for that. It might have gone on forever without a title if he hadn't helped me. Thank you, John. And Annie Baldwin took my picture on the back, so I thank Annie. Okay, chapter 1. How should I characterize my mood during the winter of 2013-2014? If I were writing verse, I'd use phrases like snow daft and winter poor, or perhaps resurrect a word like tristful. My uneasy mindset made concentration difficult. Reading Federico Garcia Lorca, whose dazzling metaphors never failed to fire my mind, I laze into sorrowful reflection. More modern poets, their running angst on every page left me alienated. I felt as frozen as the ice pond back of our townhouse. I should mention Matthew here. Despite everything, he remains my partner. His name, along with mine, is on the mortgage. We share gas and electric bills. He launders his clothes on Saturdays, and I do mine on Mondays. More about him later. I was speaking of my malaise. It didn't help that I'd been forced into an outreach assignment for the university, not to be outdone by her peers in the sociology and education departments. The dean of the English department volunteered my services to teach a poetry class at the high-medium security prison, the all-male prison near our town. My first walk across the prison yard with hungry eyes of sex-deprived heterosexual men on me was unnerving. I could smell their release of hormones. Heart pounding, I dashed toward the entrance. As time passed, I became somewhat inured to the weekly assault. Chin high, posture erect, eyes alert. I walked staunchly across the yard to the classroom. Inside the door, I'd breathe a sigh of relief. Most of the inmates signed up to write poems to wives and girlfriends. Others, meaning to shock and mortify, penned odes to the turds in their toilet bowls, or snot blown from their noses, or corpses they'd seen rotting in alleys. Occasionally, to keep order, I'd need to call for a guard. My most serious student was Amin Hotep Jones. With regularity, he checked out poetry books from the meager library collection and brought them to class. Longfellow, Kipling, Riley, an anthology or two. After gaining approval from the EA, or Education Administrator, I added volumes by Angelou, Hughes, Neruda, Brooks, and other more relevant poets to the collection. Lorca was banned. The EA thought Hispanic inmates might become too agitated by his descriptions of bullfights and gory deaths. While it was true that the Latinos tended to pore over the works of Spanish and Central American poets, I thought his objection ridiculous. Lorca's elegies to the dead bullfighter Ignacio Sanchez Mejas were gorgeous, but one didn't argue aesthetics with the prison administration. When I queried Ahmed about his name, he said his ancestors came from a city along the Nile. Though he claimed to have Kunta Kinte stories, he never shared them. I wondered if it was because I was white. A tall, thin man with a shaved head and bronze skin, Ahmed brought dignity into every room he entered. He was deeply spiritual, and there were times, as when a robin sang outside the classroom window or sleet pelted against the panes, that we turned to listen as one person. I felt the force of his persona at those times, or perhaps soul. Originally from North Carolina, he wrote of rivers, red clay, and live oaks, sometimes the ocean. The poems I liked best were his odes to Astarte, the Middle Eastern fertility goddess. I couldn't help but wonder if a flesh and blood woman had inspired his work. One of his poems I had committed to memory. Velvet skin like a hound's ear. During the night, did the honeybees suck your lips? Did you comb the night into your hair? And is the moon your tiara? Ahmed's Astarte was many things. In other poems, he depicted her as meek as Moses, a song, a savior. So many metaphors. How could one woman possess so many traits? Perhaps she never existed, except in his mind. The third week of class, a guard cornered me in the teacher's lounge. "You're paying a lot of attention to inmate Jones," he said. "He's a killer. Shot a man in a liquor store robbery." I was stunned, never dreaming Ahmed was a murderer. "Don't be fooled by his changed man act," he warned. "If he had a knife, he'd slit your throat. He's sly. His cell walls are covered with Bible verses. Wants us to think he's saved. Well, didn't Christians believe everyone was redeemable?" "How long has he been incarcerated?" I asked. 3 years, maybe. He should have stayed down south, got in with the gang when he moved to Chicago. Guards had been known to lie, particularly to female employees. They feared we would come into the sway of inmates and jeopardize security. It didn't set right with me that Ahmed had killed. If the guard was telling the truth, I wonder if Ahmed had been wrongfully convicted. Space break. 3 weeks later, I awoke feeling wretched. Head pounding, I squinted out my bedroom window to see that a dusting of snow covered the ground. My eyes focused on a forlorn maple, its bare limbs beseeching the heavens. In an instant, the tree transformed to a trembling man, then changed back to a tree. I was left with a terrible presentiment of calamity. Swallowing a Tylenol, I dressed and drove to the prison to teach my class. At the gate, a guard blocked my way. "Go home," he said. "The prison's on lockdown." I tensed. What happened? Somebody got stabbed. I remembered my vision of the trembling man. Had he been the stabbing victim? I went home, put the heating pad on my aching head, and turned on the TV. I fell asleep worrying about Matthew driving on the icy roads when he arrived home. I awakened. "Thank God you're all right," I said. He knit his brows. "A psychic headache?" I nodded. The slightest motion brought on dizziness. He made me a cup of tea and a slice of cinnamon toast, pampering, as my mother had done when I was a child. Later that evening, the warden held a televised press conference saying an inmate had been stabbed. He withheld identification pending notification of kin. "I wonder who was killed," I said. "You're not greatly attached to anyone at the prison, are you?" asked Matthew. "No, but..." There was Ahmed Jones. That weekend, I was preparing a potato and leek casserole for dinner when Matthew appeared around the corner. "Come look at the TV." The warden appeared on the screen looking dapper in a pinstripe suit. He identified the murdered inmate as Almond Jones, member of a hobo gang. He'd been killed by a Latin king. I cried out and sank onto the sofa. Almond's face appeared before me, his eyes lit with discovery, his voice hushed. Savoring the words of Langston Hughes, I thought of his poetry. His talent had been nascent, but with time and study, what could he have achieved? Was he in your poetry class? Asked Matthew, his eyes searching mine. My brightest student. I'm sorry, Maria. I don't know if he had family. He came from the South. Let's have an early night tonight, said Matthew. I'll do the dishes, and then we'll go to bed. Sleep will do us both good. The following day, I received a call from the dean. Because of Almond's murder, the university had canceled all prison outreach programs. I put his poems in a drawer and turned my attention to my university classes. Space break. If winter had delivered the blow of Almond Jones' death, then spring with its azure skies, budding jonquils, and leafing trees should have lightened my heart. Sadly, I found out Matthew was having an affair with a colleague. Originally from Togo, Matthew taught Black Studies at the university. I taught poetics and published a book of poems every 18 months. We had been together for 11 years, and although I had once before questioned his loyalty, he convinced me I was in error. I wonder if I really had been. He and I had a long-standing arrangement to lunch together on Wednesdays. I arrived at his office thinking of tuna, cashew salad, and a glass of Pinot Noir. As I opened the door, I found him copulating with a groaning woman who lay spread-eagled on top of his desk. Her yellow skirt was pushed over her head, rather like a felled tulip blossom. For an instant, I was unsure of what I was seeing. Was this another of my visions? Matthew saw me and froze. The woman yanked down her skirt and darted behind a file cabinet. The only sounds were those of my footfalls and creaking boards as I ran down the corridor, found a restroom, and vomited into the toilet. Afterwards, I realized I must have intuited his infidelity, and that had been the cause of my winter angst. I moved the incidents and its ramifications to my head, not trusting my heart to respond in my best interest. I tried to analyze the situation. Perhaps Matthew and I went our separate ways too often. We usually had summers free, but he was interested in anthropological sites, and I was always seeking inspiration, which I suppose I could have found amid the stones of Skara Brae or Machu Picchu, but I didn't really enjoy rugged living. Sand in food, bug bites, and pit latrines upset my sense of well-being. While Matthew dug for bones and treasure, I'd skip off to some lovely place, replete with modern conveniences. Perhaps we were too invested in furthering our careers, whatever the reason for our troubles. He broke my heart. He swore to end the relationship with his inamorata, but I told him not to bother and moved into the guest room. Occasionally, after I'd drunk too much, he would tempt me into our king-size bed. Enveloped in a boozy haze, I'd participate in what passed for lovemaking, but when it was over, when I was lying on the cold sheets, I'd remember his treachery. Disgusted with him and with myself, I'd slink back to the guest room. I wanted to go away, to put time and space between Matthew and me. There were a number of places I could go. Friends in London asked me to visit. My cousin invited me to accompany her to Paris. I could go to San Francisco, which I found achingly beautiful. I could go any place, alone. Then I had no idea that escape would take me to the barrier islands off the Carolinas, and I would meet a plain-spoken man who would sweep me off my feet, or that I would confront murders so clever they baffled the constabulary in 3 cities. I had no idea that I would search for and find Almond Jones' earlier writings that were both inflammatory and healing. He would live again on the Outer Banks, and I would be there to see his rising.